Okay, just we have 1 minute to 9, so maybe we will wait just 1 minute.
I think it's less than 1 minute. I think it's about 20 seconds.
Well, on my computer is 1 to 9. So, okay, I will share my screen. Okay, it's 9. So, hello everyone. Okay. On behalf of the Polish Society for Human and Evolution Studies Award Committee, it's my great honor to announce that on December 8th, 2019, the committee chose Dr. Katarzyna Pisanski as the 2019 winner of the Professor Jan Strzałko Award for Outstanding Young Scientist. Dr. Pisanski is currently a CNRS researcher in the Language Dynamics Lab at the University of Lyon, France, and I believe a researcher in the Institute of Psychology at the Wrocław University. She completed her graduate studies in 2014 in experimental psychology at McMaster University, Canada. Her research focuses on understanding the origins, development, mechanisms, and functions of acoustic communication in mammals, including humans, and is considered an emerging leader in the field of voice research. As a part of the prize, Dr. Katarzyna Pisanski receives a diploma of recognition from the Society. Many congratulations, Kasia. And Dr. Pisanski will now deliver a special lecture in which she will present an account of her scientific achievements. So Kasia, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Pani Kaszycka. It is an honor to accept the award, and very nice that despite last year's pandemic, both me and Jitka are able to present this year. So it's an honor. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Absolutely.
It's okay? Okay, super. So I will attempt to share my screen. Okay, how's that? I will enable my sound so you can hear all of the wonderful pain vocalizations I'm going to play you this morning. Okay. Okay, how's that? Can you see my first slide? Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Wonderful. I'm just going to put on my timer here to keep to our satellite time. Okay, wonderful. So thank you again. As I say, it's an honor to give this special talk and to accept this award. And PTNCE is a very special conference for me. I've been part of it for many years, and I hope next year we can all meet in living flesh. So today I will talk about human nonverbal vocal communication from form to function. And before I start to discuss the research, I'd like to introduce you to some of my key co-authors and collaborators. So you will see their names on many of the papers that I will present to you today, but I'd also like to emphasize that many of the ideas and the framework of the research program has really been born from many years of collaboration with these individuals, and in particular with David Wiebe, who's a professor of ecology at the NS Lab, which is a sensory ethology lab in Saint-Étienne, France. So my research for the past about decade now has focused on human vocal communication. And like all of you, I'm interested, of course, in the big ultimate questions, like what are the social functions of this particular human behavior? What are the adaptive functions? What are the phylogenetic roots across species? But I'm also interested in the more mechanistic side of things, like what are the anatomical or neuromechanisms that drive voice production and perception, and how do our voices change and develop across the lifetime, and how do we learn nonverbal communication? Many of you will recognize this framework as representing the 4 questions of Nicola Tinbergen, who is, of course, one of the founding fathers of modern ethology. And I really believe that this very multidisciplinary framework, these 4 questions, are critical to really understand the evolution of any behavior. You need to really understand both the mechanism and the ultimate functions. And I think that vocal behavior is not an exception. Today, I will focus on my more recent research program, and I think the sort of next 5 years of my research program on human nonverbal vocalizations. So these are non-linguistic sounds that we produce, like cries, screams, laughter, moans, groans, grunts, and so forth. And compared to speech in the human voice science research, especially in evolutionary psychology, these kinds of nonverbal vocal sounds are remarkably understudied compared to speech. And I hope today to convince you that, in fact, they are very worthy of research interest. So why? Why are these non-linguistic sounds so important to study? First of all, these nonverbal sounds, like cries and laughs, are able to take up a much broader amount of the human vocalic space than speech. We can do incredible things with our voices, and especially when we produce things like screams and cries. And the frequencies of our voices, the amplitude and so forth, really take up a much broader amount of the space of what we can do with our voice compared to speech. Speech is really just the tip of the iceberg of what we can do. Nonverbal vocalizations are also ubiquitous. We use them in our everyday social conversations across broad social contexts, and they're observed in every culture that's been studied to date. Nonverbal vocalizations in humans obviously emerge before speech because we cry before we speak, so in our ontogeny, but they also emerge before speech, very likely in our phylogeny, because our ancestors probably started to scream before they started to speak. Another reason that human nonverbal vocalizations are important is that they are similar in many ways, and I hope to convince you today, homologous in many ways, to the calls of other animals. And this, of course, is something that Darwin recognized already 150 years ago. And these cross-species comparisons between more closely or more distantly phylogenetically related animals with our own species really can provide key insight into the origins and evolutionary roots of these nonverbal vocal sounds in humans. But, and this is a very big but, we humans, unlike most other terrestrial mammals, including other primates, have remarkable control over our voices. I can very easily raise my voice pitch or lower my voice pitch, and I can even laugh spontaneously at a joke that's not funny, which is something that we do all of the time in conversation. And other animals cannot so readily and easily do this. And we believe that this capacity for vocal control in humans is really the key to understanding the difference between us and the evolution of vocal communication. So I will come back to this, but just to summarize the key argument here, what I'm arguing is that nonverbal vocalizations like cries, laughs, and screams in our own species represent something like the missing link between animal calls and human speech, something like a living fossil that we can study to better understand how we got this far. So one of the first questions to really focus on in this area of research is whether form reflects function in human nonverbal vocalizations. In other words, are our vocalizations homologous to those of other animals with whom we share ancestral links? When I speak about form, I really mean the acoustic structure of the vocalization. And when I speak about function, I mean its sort of social and evolved function, its role. So when we think, for example, of a lion's roar, the acoustic structure of the roar is not arbitrary. The roar is acoustically designed, so to speak, to communicate threat and dominance and physical formidability. Just like a puppy's whine is acoustically structured in a way that communicates distress and elicits aid, often from the mother. So the question is, are non-linguistic sounds that humans produce also like this? Does the form, does the structure of our vocalizations map onto the ostensible evolved function of that vocalization? We think so, and I think a baby's cry is probably the perfect example to exemplify this. So a baby's cry, the acoustic structure of the human baby cry shares a lot of links and similarities with the acoustic structure of the distress vocalizations of lots of other mammals. And those of you who, well, we've all heard babies cry, so you can imagine. But so here are two examples of spectrograms produced by one baby. These are two cries produced by the same baby in two different contexts. In one context, the baby is receiving a bath and they simply don't like the bath. And in the other context, they are receiving a painful vaccination. So normally I would ask, which do you think it is? But I don't see anybody. So I'm just going to have you think to yourself, which of these spectrograms corresponds to the distress bath vocalization and which is the painful vaccine cry? And the answer is, so the top spectrogram is the bath cry, and the second is the vaccine cry. And now I will play these for you, and you can perhaps give me a thumbs up if you hear them, just to make sure the sound is working. So this is the bath cry. Can you hear that? Great. And now here's the vaccine cry. For those of you who want, you can mute your computer audio for a moment. So I think you can hear and possibly also see the difference between these two cries. The vaccine cry, which is the more painful context, you can hear sounds a lot more harsh and rough. And you can also see this in the spectrogram. So this, for example, is what's causing that harshness. These are nonlinear phenomena. And in this case, I'm showing you the most extreme form of nonlinear phenomena, which is chaos, deterministic chaos. And this occurs when the vocal folds start to vibrate completely chaotically rather than aperiodically. And it is this rough sound that we hear. And we think that it's characteristics like these acoustic characteristics like nonlinear phenomena that have evolved to exploit the audition of the listener. They are so annoying to listen to and so difficult to habituate to that they motivate the listener to want to stop the aversive signal. And in the case of a baby's cry, this motivates mom and dad to come to the care of the baby. So that is the function of the baby's cry. And these are data that we collected in France several years ago. These were all French babies, and we found this consistently across individuals. But recently, we've also just replicated this on babies in a much different, non-weird environment in the Congo. And we see again that the bath cry of Congolese babies is much smoother, much more tonal compared to the vaccination cry, which you see here again, several types of nonlinear phenomena. So here we have subharmonics, which are represented as these additional harmonics in between the main harmonic frequencies. Vibrato-like frequency modulation is this sort of jitteriness that you really hear when the baby's voice is starting to shake a lot. And again, the chaos here. And in fact, oftentimes these pain cries, these vaccine cries, are composed just entirely of chaos, which is the most difficult thing to habituate to. So these were data that NS postdoc Clement Kornek collected just before the pandemic in the Congo, and that are now in preparation to be submitted. What we also did in the Congo was play these cries to Congolese parents or non-parents and ask them to distinguish, it's a cry, is it a bath cry or a vaccine cry, and to also judge the level of pain. Now, in the case of the Congo, rather than using your typical sliding scale as we would with the French listeners, we used visual representation, a simpler paradigm that we piloted on this sample of individuals. And what we find is that both French parents and Congolese parents and non-parent adults are able to reliably judge distress and pain levels from cries, and they use the acoustics that we would expect them to use to do this, typically nonlinear phenomena. They also rely on voice pitch, which is not a good indicator, but that's for another talk. Another, I think, excellent example of form mapping onto function in human vocalizations are extreme adult pain cries. And one great natural example, of course, is a woman giving birth. in this case, we recorded about 25 women who chose for their own reasons not to take an epidural or pain relief. And so these are real pain cries. And what you can see here is 3 spectrograms corresponding to the first, second, and third phase of the childbirth. So the first phase is typically quite less painful than the others. You can hear it's just a lot of breathing and pushing. The second phase is much more painful. And then the third phase is the expulsion phase. The baby is coming out. This is the most extreme pain. And I will play you this again so you can hear the nonlinear phenomena at the beginning of this third phase. So again, you can mute your sound if you like. If anyone hasn't had their coffee yet, I think I've just given you a dose of coffee. So this third phase, again, the more painful phase, we find is characterized by more of these harsh nonlinear phenomena compared to the other phases of the labor. So as the pain increases, so do these acoustic parameters. And we found, these are data and box plots created by my postdoc, Daria Valente, and we also found that as the labor progresses, the third stage, which is the dark red boxes here, is also typically longer vocalizations, higher in pitch, a lot more of this frequency modulation, and a lot more of these nonlinear phenomena. And in this case too, when we play these childbirth vocalizations to listeners, whether they are obstetricians and midwives or completely non-medically associated naive listeners, they're able to judge the stage of the labor, first, second, or third, just from the acoustics of the vocalization. And they can also judge the reported pain level, because all of the women that we recorded were reporting their pain level on a visual scale. And so again, listeners seem to be able to functionally retrieve the information from the vocalizations. So from these few examples, I've just focused on pain today, but there are many other examples. We do believe that form appears to map onto function in human vocalizations, and that in this way, human vocalizations are homologous to those of other species. But now I'd like to sort of shift focus a little bit to the second question, which is a highly related question that I touched on at the beginning of the talk. And that's about the origins and the functions of our ability as humans to control the production of these nonverbal vocalizations. So vocal control, as I mentioned, is extraordinarily advanced in humans compared to other animals and compared to other terrestrial mammals. And it's believed that this is most likely due to direct neocortical connections between the motor cortex and the brainstem neurons that control the laryngeal muscles and articulators, like our jaw, our lips, and our tongue, which are, of course, necessary to manipulate the form and frequencies of the voice and the pitch of the voice. Now, vocal control is present in other animals, particularly songbirds, for example, pinnipeds and cetaceans, but as I've noted already several times, it's surprisingly rudimental in non-human primates. I can scream at the top of my lungs like I'm in horrible pain right now, even if I'm not. But as I noted, other primates cannot so easily do this. And so the question is why? Why did vocal control? Why are humans so good at controlling our voices, whereas other great apes are not? And of course, one of the main ideas behind, one of the main theories is that this evolved for language, because vocal control is necessary for speech. If I want to produce different vowel sounds, I need to be able to manipulate my tongue and my lips and my jaw. And pitch production is also important for speech. However, while vocal control is necessary for speech, it almost certainly arose before speech, and it exists in many species that do not speak, like pinnipeds and cetaceans. And so something that we've proposed regarding vocal control and how it might have evolved in our species, we first proposed this idea in this TICS paper that I'm citing here. And the idea is that vocal control in humans may have first emerged not directly for language, but rather for deception. And you can think of this as one particularly good example, although maybe it's getting too old now, is the man behind the curtain, so the Wizard of Oz. So there's this very little man who is the Wizard of Oz, and he doesn't want to be seen as a little man, so he hides behind a curtain, and he has a very big, sonorous, low-pitched voice. And then he is revealed as being just a small man. There are many other examples of this in real life. And so the idea is that maybe we began to had this ability to control our voices to deceive, for example, to try to sound more dominant or physically bigger than we actually are, which of course in our evolutionary past for our ancestors would have been in many contexts an evolutionarily adaptive function. We do have evidence for this sort of vocal deception in speech. We have evidence in real life, but we also have some empirical evidence. So in a series of studies, for example, this is one of the studies in which we asked people to try to exaggerate their body size using their voice. So we asked them to try to sound as small as you possibly can and to try to sound as big as you can. And what we've found is that when people try to sound small, size attenuation here, they generally would raise their voice pitch. So try to sound a little smaller by raising their voice pitch, and they would also raise their formant frequencies, which are related to their vocal tract length. To sound big, they would lower their voice pitch and they would lower their formant frequencies. That would make essentially them sound like they have a longer vocal tract. And more recently, in this Nature Comm paper, we found that when we play these big and small voices to people, lots of listeners are in fact fooled. So they do tend to judge these people who are trying to sound big as several centimeters taller than they actually are. And this is particularly true when the listener is not able to detect that that person is trying to deceive by trying to sound big or small. When they do detect it, they're actually quite good at calibrating their estimates. So, but this is in speech. This is showing that we are able to modulate our vowel sounds, because these were vowels, to try to sound big and small. But one argument that we've been testing over the last few years, and I hope to continue to find support for, is the question of whether we can exaggerate physical traits using nonverbal vocalizations, like aggressive roars, better than speech. Again, if the roar is evolved to function as a display of threat in humans like it is in other animals, then we might expect that it should function better than speech to exaggerate traits like size and strength. So as a first test of this, we conducted some studies with Jordan Wren, who was a former PhD student of mine when I was at the University of Sussex in England. And what Jordan did was to test this prediction. He first had people come into the lab and to produce volitional vocalizations. So he would ask them to imagine various contexts, such as an aggressive context, a warlike scenario in which they are charging in war, and ask them to simply produce a vocalization to express this aggression. So we can call that an aggressive roar. Or to imagine context in which they are afraid, and to produce a vocalization in that context, so a distress scream. And here are just some examples of male and female spectrograms from each context. And you can see again that these roars are much harsher. You can see that in the spectrogram, they are lower pitched and they have a lot more nonlinearities, whereas the screams were much higher pitched and tonal, as we would stereotypically expect. So we had these people produce these roars and screams, and we also asked the same people to produce aggressive speech and distress speech sentences as control stimuli. So we conducted an extensive acoustic analysis on all of these nonverbal vocalizations and the speech, the emotional speech. I won't go into too much detail because this is not a bioacoustic group, but just to give you an idea, we conducted a PCA on the acoustic variables, and they are listed here. And this is how they were grouped into different principal components. So you have your perturbation and vibration parameters and your noise parameters in the first principal component. Here we have fundamental frequency parameters and also nonlinear phenomena. This third component represents variation in pitch. So basically how much the pitch was not monotone. And finally, the third component was how loud the vocalizations were. And so we inputted all of these principal components into a discriminant function analysis. And this scatter plot is just illustrating to you that the DFA was able, with 80% accuracy, to differentiate the 4 different vocal types just based on the acoustics. So here you see the roars as these dark red circles. And here in a different part of the acoustic space, we have the screams, and here we have speech. So this is just to show that the acoustic form of the 4 types of vocalizations, vocal stimuli, was quite different. And finally, what we did with these participants was we measured their strength. So we measured their bicep circumference, their chest strength, and their hand strength. We created a Z-score to represent the relative strength of each individual. And the reason for this was because, again, we wanted to test whether the roars that these individuals produce will express strength better than emotional speech and better than screams. So as a first test of this, we asked listeners, we played these roars, screams, and emotional sentences to listeners, and we asked them simply, how strong does this person sound to you? On a visual analog scale from not at all strong to extremely strong. And what these scatter plots are showing is, first of all, that perceived strength on the y-axis predicted the actual strength of the vocalizers, which is shown here on the x-axis. But this was particularly true for the aggressive stimuli, which are shown in red. The aggressive stimuli were also judged as stronger than distress stimuli, and we found evidence to support what we were predicting, is that roars maximized perceptions of strength relative to screams and speech. So if we look, for example, at males, you see that the roars here represented in the dark red were perceived as stronger and maximized the perceptions of strength, even compared to aggressive speech, but particularly compared to screams. People sounded weakest when they screamed. And these are, again, the same vocalizers. So their strength is not actually changing. They're just being judged as more or less strong. And we again recently replicated this in a non-weird sample with colleagues from, actually there's several authors here, I've listed them all, but for the writing process, it was particularly me and Juan David from the University of Bogota, and Karl Kleisner, who we all know from Prague University. And what we did was replicated this in 2 societies. A small-scale society, the Hadza hunter-gatherers, who are, of course, as you know, nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe living in Tanzania, and on an urban sample of Cameroonian men and women. We measured their hand grip strength, in this case, for both samples. And again, we found, you can see in this final column, that roars predicted the actual strength of the men and women in both of these societies better than speech. In this case, it was short speech like counting and vowels, or greetings like introducing oneself. And this paper is coming out in a special issue that we are co-editing with Juan David in Philosophical Transactions B on voice modulation. So this issue should come out in 2 parts in next month and in December. So from these studies, I've shown evidence that non-verbal vocalizations, in this case, aggressive roars, can communicate biological traits better than speech. In this case, dominance, well, we find it in dominance in another study, but body size and strength, which is what roars are functionally intended to communicate. But of course, we can imagine that humans might benefit not only from exaggerating physical traits, but also emotional states such as pain and pleasure. And I think it seems obvious to all of all of us that we do this all of the time. One good example is, of course, crying wolf. At some age, we're able to develop this ability to produce volitionally incredibly painful sounding vocalizations simply when we have a paper cut. So we're able to exaggerate our level of pain. But despite the fact that there's a lot of real life examples, there's not a lot of empirical research to show that this kind of crying wolf or exaggeration of emotion through nonverbal vocalizations is actually effective. The listeners are actually fooled by this sort of faking of emotion. So this is something we also tested with Jordan Rain back at Sussex. So in this case, we asked participants again to come into the lab, and we asked them to imagine different levels of physical pain and to produce vocalizations to express how much pain they are ostensibly feeling. So in one case, for example, we asked them to imagine mild pain, like stubbing your toe, and to produce a vocalization, moderate pain, like breaking your arm, or the most severe pain you can imagine, such as a life-threatening injury or childbirth. And we asked each individual to produce these 3 kinds of pain vocalizations. We conducted an acoustic analysis very similar to the one I've just shown you, and we inputted these acoustic parameters into a PCA once again, and again into a discriminant function analysis. So I'm showing you the results of the DFA in the center here, and you can again see that the acoustic components differentiate the 3 levels of pain. So here we have mild pain, which is taking up a much different part of the acoustic space than severe pain vocalizations in black. So again, this is just showing that the acoustic form of the vocalizations differs from mild, moderate, and severe pain. And so listeners potentially could use this information. On the outside, I'm also showing you some example spectrograms from the 3 different kinds of pain. I can play you a few of these. Again, I'm sorry, I wish I could play you some laughter instead, but not in today's talk. So here is a mild pain vocalization. So this is, as an example, like stubbing one's toe. It's very quiet. Play again. Very subtle. And this is an example of a volitionally produced extreme pain vocalization like childbirth. So that is a woman. I believe this one is a man. So you can hear the vibrations, the inflex. You can also hear the harsh nonlinearities, the chaos. And so it's quite incredible to me that we humans are able to replicate these nonlinearities in such an effective way. But the question is, does this fool listeners? So we played these vocalizations to another sample of unfortunate listeners, and we asked them simply, how much pain is this person experiencing? So they would have heard all of the different levels of pain. And they rated the pain on, again, a visual analog scale from no pain to extreme pain. Just to give you an idea of the means, this is just plotting the mean pain ratings for the mild, moderate, and severe pain. So you can see just overall that the mild pain vocalizations were in fact judged as much lower in pain compared to, for example, the severe pain vocalizations, which were judged as very painful. But we are interested in which acoustic parameters listeners are using and relying on to differentiate these levels of pain, and whether this is consistent across listeners. So we plotted the pain ratings against the principal components from our acoustic analysis. And you can see a very strong relationship here. In fact, the acoustic parameters explained 76% of the variance in listeners' pain ratings. So listeners are using the ostensibly correct acoustic parameters to judge pain. And we found the same thing in the playback experiments that we did with babies' cries in France and the Congo, and with women giving birth. People are really relying on the correct parameters, even for volitional vocalizations, to judge pain, as they did for real life pain vocalizations. So coming back then to the 2 broad questions that I've presented here. First, does form reflect function in human vocalizations? We have preliminary evidence that this appears to be the case, and that human vocalizations appear to be homologs of vocalizations of other, particularly terrestrial mammals, but we really need to do a great deal more research. And what's really missing in the human voice sciences right now is research on pleasure vocalizations. There is quite a large body of research on laughter from people like Disa Sauter and Greg Bryant, Carolyn McGettigan, and Sophie Scott, for example, but not a lot of research on other kinds of pleasure vocalizations. And I think part of this is because it's quite, how to say, difficult to study things like sexual vocalizations in our own species, despite the fact that there's a lot of research on sex vocalizations in other primates. And so this is some research that we're planning to conduct actually with some individuals from the Czech group, such as Jakub Binter, and individuals in Colombia like Juan David Leon Gomez, to try to understand whether form reflects function also in pleasure vocalizations, not just sexual vocalizations, but also food pleasure vocalizations. And the second question, which is even broader and more complex, is how did we humans evolve the ability to control our voices so much better than other great apes? And so we have some preliminary evidence to suggest maybe this capacity is linked to deception. Maybe we started to control our voices to try to sound bigger and stronger and more dominant and so forth in our evolutionary past. But of course, to answer this question, we need a great deal more research in a broader range of contexts. But the other aspect that's really missing, and actually I will come back to that in a moment, is more experimental control, which is really where I'd like this research program to go in the next 5 years. And I will finish with that in the next few slides. But I'd like to also pose to you several other questions that are, I think, relevant in this domain, just to get you thinking more about this. So first of all, one of the most interesting questions, I think, is when does nonverbal vocal behavior and our control emerge in our ontogeny? As I said, at some point as infants, we have this capacity to control and to produce fake crying wolf vocalizations. But when? We don't know if babies, for example, are able to exaggerate their cries to get more help from mom and dad. So this is an important research question. Studying cross-cultural differences in vocal production and perception, we've begun to study many non-weird societies and societies in between the two extremes to replicate these results, and we find that there are quite relevant consistencies across cultures. What is the role of sensory experience in nonverbal communication, including visual and auditory experience? And to answer this question, we've been studying groups of deaf individuals, studying whether people who have never heard a scream can still scream like everyone else, and how is this learned, and is sensory experience necessary to learn how to scream, for example, or to produce other kinds of vocalizations. What factors predict individual differences in efficacy in deception? Some people are really good at faking how big they sound, and other people are not so good. And I'm very interested in what cultural or physical factors can explain these individual differences. And finally, to what extent is vocal deception present in other mammals? I've mentioned many times that humans have this incredible capacity for vocal control, but this is actually a really hot and highly debated topic. A lot of individuals argue that vocal control is far more advanced in other great apes than we previously thought. And there is emerging evidence to suggest that this is true. And so this is a really hot topic and really critical to understand how we differ from other animals, to understand the evolutionary roots. So in the last, I believe, 5 minutes that I've got here, I'd like to sort of shift gears a little bit to future directions. And I'd like to introduce this program called SoundGen. So all of the data that I've shown you so far in the research has been largely based on using natural vocalizations. And the reasons for that is that we really want to understand how listeners perceive real or volitional vocalizations. But to really understand which acoustic parameters they're using, we need to go away from correlational analysis to experimental manipulation. And this SoundGen software, I'm just showing you the front page of the website for those of you who are interested in voice manipulation. This is an R package, it's open source package created by a colleague of mine, Andre Anakin, who's at Lund University and at NS. And it allows us for the first time ever to actually reproduce human nonverbal vocalizations in an incredibly realistic yet highly experimentally controlled way. So in this example here, we have a puppy whine, and you can see that we've just, using SoundGen, been able to add nonlinearities to this puppy whine. And we can do the same for human vocalizations. So here we have the original scream of a woman, and here we have the synthesized version of that scream. And so essentially what you can do is control exactly how much chaos you're adding to the scream or how high-pitched it is and so forth. And by being able to manipulate systematically these acoustic parameters, we can test their individual, experimentally test their individual effects on listeners, more or less nonlinearities, higher or lower pitch, and so forth. So here's just an example of what this synthetic scream sounds like. So in our pilot experiments, listeners are typically not very good at discriminating which of the screams are synthetic and which are original. And on Andre's website, you can hear many examples of other vocalizations like pleasure moans and roars and so forth. And in a recent paper that we'll have coming out in EEE later this year, we explain how this process can be done so that perhaps other voice scientists that are interested in adding nonlinearities or creating completely synthetic vocalizations can also do this using the SoundGen platform. And we have some recent papers that came out this year. In fact, this one's not come out yet, but this year and last year, in which we use these acoustic manipulations to test some of the predictions that I was speaking to you about today. So for example, we find that adding nonlinear phenomena to vocalizations makes people sound bigger. So if we present roars to people in which we've added these harsh nonlinearities experimentally, those individuals tend to sound bigger. And we think that this is because it causes the vocalization to sound lower pitched. We also find that nonlinear phenomena signal negative valence. So if we add these harsh sounds even to positive vocalizations like pleasure moans, those vocalizations tend to sound more negative in valence. So again, these are just examples of how we can test these predictions now more systematically using this technology. And finally, I'd like to finish with another future direction, and that is on the side of the listener. The data that I've shown you today was really asking listeners, how much pain is this individual feeling, or how strong does this individual sound using a scale? But of course, there are underlying physiological reactions that we have to a baby's cry, for example, or to a roar. And we're really interested in how the body and the brain, not just the behavior of the individual, reacts to these vocalizations. Does a vaccine cry elicit a higher physiological response or higher arousal than a bath cry, for example? And how well does that actually align with listeners' ratings? So we are collaborating with neuroscientists, and we have several physiological monitoring devices that we're testing in the lab now to move in this direction. Thank you. I think I've run out of time, and there's some time for questions. I hope it wasn't too fast. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kasia. So everyone, questions, please. Sławek?
I will stop sharing for now.
All right, now I'm muted. Hello, thank you very much for a great talk as usual. I had to get up early, but it was worth it. Okay, so my question is about the inferences for phylogeny. So you would suggest that it's possible that the evolution of vocal control, advanced vocal control in humans, kind of preceded language, right? And for me, if we want to account for language evolution in humans, then there are a couple of facts that we need to take into consideration. And one is that there are sign languages as well. And another is that there is kind of a disconnect between non-verbal and verbal information. And by verbal information, I mean like propositional referential information. So what would you say about a story that is a little bit different? That first, in human evolution or hominin evolution, we have cooperativeness and prosociality, which enables us to massively donate information, like as per information donation as studied in primatology. And then on top of that, we evolve a rudimentary system of sharing referential information, which is aided by gesture and full body pantomime and non-linguistic, non-verbal vocalization. And then from that platform, there is co-evolution of more and more advanced and efficient vocal signaling, which leads to speech at the end of the route. How would you rate that story?
I don't think it's so different, because in a sense, we are arguing that our acoustic space and our capacity became more and more complex progressively. But your story is more arguing that it would be for information transfer between individuals, whereas we are arguing more from a functional perspective. You know, information theory is very, very strong, and I realize that what we're arguing is controversial in this perspective. But basically, the idea is that we the vocal control was co-opted for language, but really started as a function to deceive, and particularly that it started in nonverbal vocalizations. So the capacity, we find, for example, in this TICS paper, we show the progressive ability to manipulate form and frequencies to exaggerate body size, starting with less phylogenetically related terrestrial mammals to other primate species, such as Diana monkeys, where you start to see some differentiation in the formants for alarm calling, all the way to articulated speech in humans. And the argument in the context of body size is that our ability to start to control our formant frequencies may have started to try to sound bigger, and then was simply co-opted for speech. Now, how to oppose those two possibilities and differentially test them, I think is the difficulty.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a quick follow-up? If okay, all right. Okay, I'll just go on. So when it comes to that, I think there is research in chimpanzees, Katie Slocum research about chimpanzees being able to exaggerate like severity of distress calls when they are attacked. Nobody is looking, then they can exaggerate to deceive how strongly they are attacked. So there are precursors. So my question would be a little bit different. So from those bases, it would be adaptive to exaggerate body size, but mostly for males, wouldn't you?
Yes, in the context of male-male competition, sure, and in a sexual selection context, yes, it's true. And we do find that males are better at exaggerating their body size, and that male listeners are better at hearing exaggeration in the size of other men. Whether there are sex differences in size exaggeration in other animals, I'm not so sure that that's been a research focus, but I would suspect that that would be the case too.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter.
Great. So taking off of that, if we assume that it's males who exaggerate, and we assume that people have volitional control, and we assume that the exaggeration is to create the impression of biggerness, let's say more fierceness, I would wonder about the role of personality here in how how men in particular might modulate their voice. And so I'm thinking of people high on like the things that I do, of course, psychopathy, narcissism, right? Mm-hmm. That these might be people that they don't natively have necessarily deeper voices, but when they engage in social interaction, they might shift to do so. And so like when I'm just talking to myself, I might sound differently than when I'm trying to establish my dominance. And this might account for some of the, like as a mediator, right? So why it's psychopathic men who are really trying to, like I'm thinking of chimpanzees, of course, and their tendency to bristle up when they're trying to, but humans don't have, my hair doesn't stand on end and you can see it, but I can posture and I can change the tone of my voice. So I'm wondering if you thought about including things like personality or maybe in the future as explanatory mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. With the colleagues at the University of Wrocław, like Piotr Sorokowski, we are testing, in Agata Turecka, we are testing the Big Five and other personality, no, not the Big Five, many other personality parameters, and how they relate to actual baseline vocalization. So we recorded people, a huge amount of people, because we need a very big sample to look at this. But that's not about vocal control. That's about whether people who have lower pitched voices are more dominant, for example. But what you're suggesting is, I think, very, very interesting, because one of the questions that I posed at the end there is what makes some people better than others? And I really think that personality is one of these big predictors, but that has not been tested yet, and that's on my list for sure. What do you think would predict then that narcissism perhaps would?
Yeah, so the Big Five is unlikely to show much action because it's such a, say, socially desirable set of traits. But I would predict, psychopathy, for example, and narcissism. Yeah.
People who are better at manipulating others.
And alternatively, I would expect, for instance, Machiavellianism isn't to be associated with vocal control, but in a form of suppression, right? So they'll modulate down when they're angry because they don't want to create the wrong
Yeah.
impression, and you could see the
Better
anger,
inhibition.
you could see the anger that like Hillary Clinton must feel, and she can't raise her voice; she has to suppress it, and so that way those would be my predictions. I don't know, and then dark triad is very easy to measure these days.
Okay, it's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, next question, Babush.
Okay, thanks, Kasia. Great talk, of course, fascinating. I was wondering, what about counter strategies against deception? Because you would expect that there was some selection pressure on recipients to detect different level of deception. So is it like, for example, with lying, that there are studies that we are very bad in detecting lies? And what about this? Because those persons who would be kind of protected against deception should have a bigger fitness, of course. So do you want to study, or do you aim to study some counter strategies against the deception?
I didn't have time to go into those data, but that's a critical question, because you're right, there's going to be selection pressure on the vocalizer to deceive, but at the same time, there will be selection pressure on the listener to detect the deception and to recalibrate. And we find that in the Nature Communications paper, that we play the deceptive vocalizations to listeners, so people who are trying to sound big and small. And as I said, that when people are not able to detect that someone is trying to sound big, then they overestimate the height. They say, oh, this person's on average 4 centimeters taller than he actually is. But we also ask them, is this person deceiving or not? And when they correctly hear that it's deceptive, they recalibrate their height judgment. So they say, this person is deceiving. So now actually they reduce the size, and the error is very small. So you see this very interesting, yes, as you say, people are able to detect deception, and when they do, they can recalibrate their height judgment. But the really interesting thing is that they only detect deception about half of the time. So it still, in a way, pays off for the deceiver to deceive, because half of the time they will not be noticed, at least in this experiment. We need to do many more studies like this.
Yeah, according to the rule, better safe than sorry.
Exactly, yes. There's no big cost in this case, especially if you're not caught half of the time. Thank you, great question.
Thanks a lot.
Kasia, actually on this, because I mean, you've been talking about deception in terms of size, but the data that you used with pain, right, that was all deceptive data, right?
Yes.
It was, people were asked to sound like they were in pain. And I would have thought that people would have a bigger problem making it sound like they're in pain when they're not. And people would, on the other hand, people would be better figuring out when people are deceiving about whether they are in pain or not.
Yes, we haven't done this from the side of the listener with the pain vocalizations. So you're predicting that people will be better at discriminating if someone's actually in pain or not, whether they're faking or not. It's interesting because when we look at authenticity ratings, people are really quite bad at discriminating between real or acted pain vocalizations, but so I don't know. I think it would still work very similar to the body size, but it's actually quite difficult to distinguish between when it comes to human emotional vocalizations, to say that something is real or acted. These are really a false dichotomy, because if you think about when you stub your toe, you're probably going to produce a little bit of a vocalization, but if somebody is there to hear it, you might produce a slightly louder vocalization. And it's not to say that that's acted or not. It's just somewhere on a continuum, because it's a social communication. So there's many factors. And so really in this research, we also need to step away from this dichotomy of acted versus genuine and find a better way to also capture these vocalizations that are somewhere in between, where we produce real vocalizations, but we exaggerate them or modulate them in a way. And so it's a mix.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I'm just thinking you could get some great vocalizations, but probably the ethics board would have a problem with that.
Yes, with pain. This is why we have to do the childbirth vocalizations. Maybe 50 years ago, but.
Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. You mentioned that kind of you see deception as one of the key drivers, possible key drivers for kind of the extension of the evolution of language. And I was thinking, what about other factors and if they have a place in kind of this approach? So Pira Filippi, for example, in her work, looked at kind of the fact that basically humans and basically all animals are very good at recognizing arousal in all kinds of animals, like low arousal versus high arousal. So humans, for example, can identify that in many different species. And kind of her theory goes more into that it's emotional voice intonation and the modulation of emotional voice intonation that plays a large role in social emotional bonding. And I was wondering kind of what you think of that kind of approach, that it's kind of more the whole range of communicating emotions and being better at communicating emotions for purposes of interpersonal communication.
That's not so different either, though, because it's in a way, if you are trying to volitionally communicate an emotion, I mean, either it's a vocalization that's produced in response to your physiological response, or your physiological arousal, for example. So you feel stress and it affects your voice, or you feel sad, it affects your voice, or happy, which is not really vocal control. But when you are wanting to communicate an emotion by exaggerating this, for example, or communicating something completely volitionally, then again, you're getting into, maybe deception is not the right word. You know, deception just means, I mean, deception is a heavy word, but what you're saying is, and what Pierre is arguing, is very similar. It's just wanting to communicate something. And to do that, you need to have control over the way that your vocalization sounds to others. So whether it's deception, manipulation, or just social communication, it's all kind of the same. There's some interesting work that's come out of the group of Marcus Perlman and Bodo Winter, where they find that they did this huge cross-cultural study, and people were asked to make vocalizations to reflect things and sounds and nouns like water or a knife cutting something. And across cultures, you find that people can recognize the sound of a knife or the sound of water. And so they argue that maybe the vocal control started from sort of an iconicity perspective. So there's many opposing arguments for this.
Okay, thank you.
Great question.
Sławek again.
Yes, I actually have a follow-up comment on that, because that study by Perlman and Alexandra Ćwiek and others. So this is great research, but the title of the paper is something that I'm super critical about, because they say novel vocalizations are understood across cultures. And what the results are is that people across cultures can guess the meanings of novel vocalization from a closed set of alternatives. So it's a multiple alternatives forced choice above chance. Yeah. Sometimes well above chance, but that's not equivalent to that's different from understanding. So that's a part of a different argument about the iconic potential of the vocal modality versus gestural modality. But okay, so my question is actually different. My question is this: how do you get around the practical problem of getting people to vocalize, to do like fake vocalizations, because people tend to be extremely self-conscious when doing like non-verbal vocalizations?
It's true. Actually, with the first two papers that I showed you from Jordan Ray, my PhD, we tried with students from the university. And ultimately, what he needed to do was bring in drama students to produce these vocalizations, because they were far less inhibited, and their vocalizations sounded much more realistic. So it is a common problem. And when I was recording the Hatsa, producing the roars and the fierce screams, I was amazed how uninhibited they were. In fact, we had to step far away with the microphone and change the entire setup because they were so loud and completely uninhibited. There's no social faux pas there against producing these sorts of emotional vocalizations. So it's very culturally variable. And I haven't found a great way other than trying to get people to relax. And sometimes we just have to discard the vocalizations from people who were far too inhibited. And I think there will always be individual differences, and you just need a large enough sample to be able to get the people who are producing so-called real vocalizations. But there are also individual differences in genuine vocalizations. Some women don't vocalize at all when giving birth, for example. And that's also a form of inhibition. So it's, I think it's natural.
Thank you very much. This is super interesting. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Kasia.
It was a pleasure.
That's been great. It's now time for us to move on to the second speaker today, Michael Player. Are you ready?
Yeah.